This program tonight is really exciting. I had the fun job of having to put together the PowerPoint for John and Tom, and they picked out their pictures and we got it all lined up, and I got to see the script and got to go through the practice run. You are in for a treat. This is a really neat program, and I'm going to give you a hint. It was so cool that it's like, you know what? This has to become something more permanent. So I took their script and I've rearranged it so that we can now do a house tour using their information. So we're going to start offering tours of the house that are just art oriented, and we'll go through the room and you'll see this information. So watch that. We will start hosting those probably on a special Saturday and take reservations for that program. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask the creators of this program to get started. There he is, John Huss, our mastermind of this, and he will bring Tom up when he's at that point. Thank you. This one's mine.
Yeah, those are back there. Thanks, Beth. Good evening, everyone. This is lovely to have such an intimate gathering, and thanks so much for coming. And yes, this is a brand new bow tie, just for this evening. So, somebody's asked me that question. Are we ready to go, Matthew? Okay. I'm sure most of you who have visited the various furnished rooms of the historic Trask House at one time or another have admired the Manchester-made furniture, as well as many other treasures and artifacts from the town's fascinating past. But I suspect far less attention has been paid to the many works of fine art in our collection. Portraits, landscapes, oils, watercolors, pastels, lithographs, and even sculpture. Today, with the welcome assistance of Tom Halstead, I will take you on a guided tour of our art galleries and introduce you to the artists whose creativity we are so proud to display. Not included will be works by any contemporary local artist, a subject perhaps for a future program or exhibition. To my knowledge, the museum has never purchased any of the art will be seen this evening. Instead, building our collection through gifts and loans over the 130 years the Manchester Historical Society has been in existence. Not surprisingly, many of our earliest paintings of Manchester are unsigned, such as this charming oil of the Inner Harbor as it looked around 1880. At the left, we see what was known as Knight's Wharf, now the site of Peel House Square. Center and right, we see Smith's Point. Notice how few trees are standing back in those days. Here's a watercolor of the house at 51 Union Street, built in 1775 for a blacksmith who cared for the horses of guests staying at Deacon John Allen's Tavern and Inn, directly across the street. And that house is still there, right at the top of Union Street. The painting dates to the 1860s, when the house was owned by the Brown family. Next, we see the parlor of the Browns' home, quite possibly done at the same time by the same unknown artist. We do know who painted the next town landmarks we'll see, a multi-talented resident named William Henry Tappan. Born in 1821, he received training in draftsmanship, that's the skill of making detailed drawings, at a Boston engraving firm. The Tappan painting we see here depicts the old Colby house, which once stood at the corner of Friend and School Streets. Next is the Knight Low House, which dates back to 1690 and is reputed to be the town's first tavern. Prior to its demolition in 1890, it stood in the Ocean Street area off of Summer Street. And here's Tappan's painting of what was known as the Townhouse. Built in 1818, this was originally a schoolhouse, then served as a multi-purpose municipal building and lyceum, until it was sold in 1891 to Samuel Knight, who had it moved across the channel to a site on Elm Street. All three of Tappan's house paintings are oils on a wooden board. In his later years, Tappan worked as a civil engineer, but continued to draw, providing sketches for noted naturalist Louis Agassiz, as well as a series of illustrations that appear in Reverend Lamson's 1895 History of the Town. This is Tappan's drawing of Foster's Wharf, one of several landings for local fishermen. Tappan also designed the official town seal, that same year as part of Manchester's 250th anniversary celebration. The Manchester Historical Society was instrumental in having Lamson's town history published. William Henry Tappan just happened to have been one of the society's founders and its first president. Also painting local scenes through the 19th century was Edwin Payson Stanley. A Civil War veteran, and here we see him with some of his Civil War medals, Stanley returned home to start a commercial house painting business. Over time, he became a recreational painter, producing many local scenes and supposedly even some portraits. Here's his view of the town common, done in pastels on paper in 1870. The handsome First Parish Church dominates the scene, but also of note are the two low buildings to the left. The one closest to the church was where Andrew Lee opened the town's first drugstore in 1856. The other building, obscured by the trees, was a two-story emporium known as the Old Corner Store. Stanley's skill as an artist can in no way compare to Tappan's, but there's something very endearing about his work. Take this folky oil painting of the area just west of the town common. At the right is the three-story cabinet shop of Rustin Marshall, built where Seaside No. 1 stands today. In the background are some of the buildings along Church Row. Notice the small white shed dead center. That does not appear in Stanley's original painting, but was added at some later date. Apparently the owner of the painting wanted his scene to be as up-to-date as possible. And I've been asked, why don't you restore it to its original? But I think it's kind of neat to have that little white shed there. Stanley was active in town affairs, serving as tax collector and president of the Elder Brethren. He was also instrumental in helping the town purchase the Chowder House parcel of land on Tux Point in 1895, was one of the 11 founding members of the Manchester Yacht Club, and was instrumental in helping the Manchester Historical Society acquire the Trask House as its headquarters shortly before his death in 1924. And that's how it looked then. It was in the cabinet shop of Rustin Marshall that we've just seen that this piano was built in 1875 as a birthday present for 10-year-old Isaac Marshall. Isaac, son of the shop's co-owner, Nehemiah Marshall, grew up to be one of Manchester's leading citizens. He was a world traveler, author, public speaker, and founder and longtime editor of the Manchester Cricket. He was also, as we see here, not a bad amateur artist. This oil on canvas of Eagle Head at the eastern end of Singing Beach was probably done in the 1920s or 30s. Upon his death in 1951, the Manchester Historical Society was bequeathed close to 100 items from his estate, including artifacts from his travels abroad, and much of the fine furniture that we see today in the first floor rooms of the Trask House. Our next painter of local landmarks is Manchester artist Tom Baker, the son-in-law of Edward Stanley, who we had previously met. This is Baker's painting of the old Story High School, which used to stand at the corner of Norwood Avenue and Brook Street. For some 20 years, Baker ran his own commercial studio in Boston, providing artwork for the board games produced by Parker Brothers in Salem, among many other projects. Following service as an officer in the U.S. Coast Guard during World War II, Baker began to focus more and more on maritime scenes, such as we see here. This was painted in 1974 and depicts the rainbow winning the America's Cup in 1934. It is in a private collection here in Manchester, and we thank the gentleman who is with us this evening who lent it to us. We much appreciate having a chance to make that nice photograph of it. Tom Baker produced more than 1,000 paintings in his lifetime, almost all watercolors, some of which hang in the State House in Boston and the U.S. Senate Office Building and the Corcoran Gallery of Art, both in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, we do not have any of Baker's maritime paintings in our own collection, but we do have several watercolors of historic local buildings. The Hooper House on Union Street, which was raised in 1965 to make way for a local bank. The Wigglesworth House on Old Neck Road. Two of the town's oldest homes still standing side by side on Summer Street. And last but not least, the historic Lee House on School Street. Before we purchased this center chimney colonial in 1971, Sully and I had been renting on Friend Street. Our landlords were Mary and Tom Baker. We're now going to focus on some of the portraits in our collection, starting with this charming little pair. Oil on paper in original frames, they are probably the oldest paintings we have. According to a handwritten note on the back of one, they were painted around 1800 by a Mr. Douglas. An appraisal by Skinners in 2005 identified them as being of the French school and quite possibly portray Napoleon and Josephine. This next collection of portraits are miniatures of one of Manchester's most important families, the Allens. In the days before photography, family lineage was often preserved by having formal portraits painted of each generation. Here we see 3 generations of Allen, starting with Deacon Nathan Allen, born in Manchester in 1768. In the center is one of his sons, John Perry Allen, and to the right, Nathan's grandson, John Perry Allen Jr. All 3 are painted on glass. The Allen in the center was known as the king of Manchester furniture makers during the mid-19th century, when there were as many as 43 separate cabinet shops in town. John Perry Allen specialized in producing pieces with extraordinary mahogany veneers. This tilt-top table in our collection is an excellent example of his work. Unfortunately, Allen's veneering mill, which stood on the site of Seaside 1, caught fire in 1834, igniting a blaze which destroyed a large portion of the village on both sides of Central Street. These 2 other miniatures are watercolor silhouettes on paper of Foster Allen, younger brother of John Perry Allen Sr., and Foster's wife, Sally Dodge. Their portraits were painted around the time of their marriage in 1824. Sadly, their union was short-lived. Sally died at age 32, Foster at age 36, probably from a shared disease. This impressive portrait was done about 1825 by an unknown artist. The subject is Mary Cogswell Martin, the niece of Captain Augustus W. Smith, who owned most of what we know today as Smith's Point in the 1800s. That's Captain Smith seated at the left, surrounded by his adoring family. Mary, or Molly as she was known, doesn't appear too happy in this painting, perhaps because her husband, a sea captain, was still in port. The story goes that whenever he left on a voyage, Molly would watch his departure from the widow's walk atop their house. Once Captain Martin was out of sight, Molly would hang a sheet from an upper window so her friend on Baker's Island would know the coast was clear and then row over for a visit. This portrait of Mary Martin was given to the Historical Society by Hattie Lee Harris, her grandniece. During her lifetime, Hattie Lee was the major benefactor of the Manchester Historical Society, helping convert what was then a boarding house in the 1920s into the beautifully furnished museum we enjoy today. She paid for the construction of the Assembly Hall in 1940 and established an endowment that continues to provide financial stability today. Next, a couple we know well, Abigail Hooper Trask and her husband, Captain Richard Trask. Here we see Abigail Hooper around the time she built a new home for herself and her small general store at 10 Union Street in 1823. We know nothing about the artist other than he or she was reasonably well trained and skilled enough to capture the strong character of his subject. Note the firm chin, the unwavering gaze of Abby as she stares at the artist. She bristles with self-confidence and has no qualms about being portrayed wearing spectacles, highly unusual for a woman of that era. In her hand, the artist has placed a quill pen, reminding the viewer that you are in the presence of a very successful businesswoman. And little has changed when Abby is portrayed much later in life. Her bonnet and glasses still firmly in place. A mourning brooch containing a locket of hair is still at her throat. When Abigail passed away at the age of 97, she was one of Manchester's most beloved and respected citizens. I suspect this portrait of husband Richard was painted about the same time as the first one of Abby, perhaps by the same artist on the occasion of their marriage in 1823. Here's another image of Captain Trask, this one painted on an oval of ivory just 2 years later. On the back, Abigail wrote, "This likeness of Mr. Trask was painted in 1825 in Marseille, and it was defaced by Chaz kissing it when he was a babe." Chaz refers to their only child, son Charles. Apparently, when Captain Trask was away at sea, Abigail would take this painting up to the little boy's room each evening so he could give Daddy a goodnight kiss. Now look at the two portraits side by side. Notice the captain's hairline, almost identical, wouldn't you say? Suggesting that the larger portrait was indeed painted around the time of his marriage in 1823. Sadly, there is no other portrait of Captain Trask later in life. He died at home in Manchester at the age of only 58. The portraits of two other Manchester sea captains hang proudly on our walls. Here's Captain Thomas Leach and his wife Hannah. These oils on wood were painted around 1820 by an unknown itinerant artist, someone who would travel from town to town seeking commissions. Leach took his own son to sea at age 9 as his cabin boy, the start of a very successful 51-year maritime career for Thomas Leach Jr., seen here in a later hand-colored photograph. This dour gentleman is our other sea captain, Simeon Haskell, who was born in West Manchester in 1776. Again, we do not know the artist, but I believe we may have a possible lead, as we'll see in just a minute. Now, two more portraits, oddly enough displayed in just one frame. First, on this side of a wooden board, we meet a young girl named Helen Long. What makes this oil so interesting is that it was probably painted by not one, but two artists. The more skilled artist painted the lovely head and face. But look at the rest of the painting. From the neck down, Helen's body is completely out of proportion. Her stubby hand holds a poorly rendered rose. The background is crudely done. Surely what we have here is an apprentice at work, finishing the painting while the portraiturist may have already moved on to the next commission. Now let's flip this painting over and meet an unknown gentleman. Again, an oil painted on the back of the same wooden board, only upside down, from Helen Long. When this portrait was appraised 10 years ago, the name Sheldon Peck surfaced as the possible artist. Peck was a fascinating man. In addition to his art, he was a fierce abolitionist and an advocate for temperance, women's rights, racial equality, and public education. The kind of man I wish we had running for president today. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Peck's portraiture, with its distinctive style, is considered a prime example of 19th century American folk art. His earliest work, 1820 to 1828, consists primarily of waist-length oil portraits on wooden panels. The figures have somber faces with hard angular planes and immobile expressions and appear against dark backgrounds. Now, alongside, we see the museum's unknown gentleman. And now let me add the portrait of Simeon Haskell to the mix. Again, look at the similarities. Is it possible that we have not one, but maybe two Sheldon Peck portraits in our collection? Let's hope so. This Peck portrait was discovered behind a $25 lithograph. It sold at auction for $79,000. Our final portrait is of Masconomo, chief of the Agawams, who greeted Governor John Winthrop when he anchored off the shores of Manchester on his way to founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. It is our understanding that it was painted by our friend William Henry Tappan in 1895 as part of the town's 250th anniversary celebration. It was originally a full-length, life-size portrait on canvas, but only the head and shoulders you see have survived. We'll revisit this portrait later in our program. Family members weren't the only subjects of 19th century portraiture. Many a ship's owner or captain would commission an artist to paint and portrait their vessel, usually a side view under full sail with the owner's flag or name of the vessel flying from the top of the mainmast. This painting of the Matilda by Fitzhenry Lane is a good example. It has been said that many of these sea captains, if offered a choice, would prefer to have a portrait of his ship on display rather than his wife. We have several ship paintings in our collection, all but one by unknown artists. Here's the ship Fanny Giffney, built in Kennebunkport, Maine in 1853. She was lost at sea just 2 years later while transporting salt from Liverpool to New Orleans. Our second ship is the John Hale, built in Durham, Maine in 1827. Here we see her in 1832 under the command of Manchester's own Samuel Crowell. Crowell's wife was Mary Trask, the daughter of Captain Richard Trask by his first marriage. In 1904, Samuel Crowell's daughters built and donated the Crowell Chapel to the town as a memorial to their brother Benjamin Crowell. Our third marine painting was commissioned by its master and part owner, Richard Trask. The ship is the captain's last command, the St. Petersburg, wrecked off the coast of Liverpool, England, on January 13, 1843. Luckily, no lives were lost and she was salvaged, but the repairs were costly and took close to a year. During that time, Captain Trask commissioned an unknown English artist to paint this dramatic scene, a far cry from the formal ship portraits we've just seen. Next, the watercolor that hangs over the mantel in the Trask House Assembly Hall. In 1895, Manchester celebrated its 250th anniversary, as I've mentioned, and one of the highlights was a reenactment of Governor John Winthrop's arrival aboard the Arbella. This old postcard shows the replica of the Arbella, built in Salem, using the hull of an old sloop. And here we see her in full color, painted that year by an unknown artist. The museum acquired this painting in 1995, when it was found in a dumpster during renovations of the row block at the corner of Central and School Streets. We're very fortunate that somebody saved it for us. The final painting of a ship in our collection is a more recent work. An oil on canvas, it was done by Alfred C. Needham of Manchester in the 1920s. It shows a salt bark anchored off Gloucester Harbor. A label on the back indicates it was exhibited at the 1927 exhibition of the Gloucester Association of Artists. Al Needham was a man of many interests. In addition to painting, he played 3 instruments, composed songs, was an expert on watch cases, sailing ships and miniatures, and an avid collector of stamps, coins, and buttons. He also served as a secretary of the Manchester Historical Society. The next portion of tonight's program will focus on some of the better-known artists of the 19th and 20th centuries who have a Manchester connection, either as artists in residence or who simply visited here to capture the unique beauty of our seaside community. All these artists we're about to meet received formal training and were highly regarded professionals. Unquestionably, the most famous artist in the museum's collection is Fitzhenry Lane, unmatched by any other 19th century American artist in capturing the character of maritime New England. This beautiful painting of Gloucester from Rocky Neck is on display at the Cape Ann Museum, which owns the largest collection of Lane's work in the world. Here we see all the qualities that makes Lane's art so distinctive, so powerful. The huge expanse of luminescent sky, the perfect balance of elements, the incredible attention to detail. Before Lane would lay oil on canvas, he would first draw the entire scene in pencil, ensuring that every detail, from the rigging in the ships to the windows in each building, was 100% accurate. Here is a preliminary sketch Lane made of Eaglehead in Manchester. Unfortunately, this never evolved into a finished oil painting. Now here's the Lane in our collection, a lithograph of the Gloucester Harbor scene we just saw. It was done around 1844 when the artist was a partner in the Boston lithography shop of Lane and Scott. Lane was born in Gloucester in 1804 and was crippled his entire life, probably due to infantile polio. As a youth, he learned the rudiments of drawing and sketching at age 27, moved to Boston for formal instruction and apprenticeship with William S. Pendleton, owner of the most important lithographic firm of that day. This is Lane's first known lithograph, done in 1835. When Pendleton retired, Lane formed his own company and continued to produce illustrations for sheet music, such as this one, in addition to his lithographs. He also began to create his first oil paintings, mostly shoreline scenes around Cape Ann, such as this view from Kettle Cove in Manchester, done in 1847. A year later, with his reputation firmly established, Lane returned to Gloucester, built this stone house overlooking the harbor, and spent the rest of his relatively short life producing masterpieces such as we see here. Here are 2 more Lane paintings, supposedly of Manchester. Kettle Island on the left and a scene of a boat grounded at Dana's Beach, although some experts suggest they were painted from Good Harbor Beach in Gloucester instead. Both were done by Lane in collaboration with his gifted student, Mary Blood Mellon. Working alongside Lane in his studio, Mellon made meticulous copies of his work and established her own reputation as a competent 19th century landscapist. But the star of the show, as far as Lane and Manchester is concerned, is this masterpiece. Entitled Manchester Harbor, it surfaced in 2004 when its West Coast owners learned that another Lane painting, A View of West Beach in Beverly, had recently sold at auction for a whopping $3.8 million. The California couple contacted the Skinner auction house to see about putting their Lane up for sale as well. Colleen Fesco, the Skinner contact, then approached the Manchester Historical Society for help confirming the exact location of the Lane painting. Archivist Slim Proctor quickly determined that Lane had probably painted from the shoreline of Norton's Point, seen in this vintage postcard. See where the little red arrow is? Looking southward out through the gap between Smith's Point and West Manchester. At the far left is Gales Point. This fresh-to-market masterpiece was sold in November 2004 for $5.5 million, the world record for a Fitzhenry Lane that stands today. Lane passed away in 1865, following either a stroke or a heart attack. In our collection are two large watercolors painted by a prolific 19th century artist with the impressive name of John White Allen Scott. Born in Roxbury in 1815, Scott spent his entire life, all 92 years of it, in and around Boston, including sometime late in life here in Manchester. Here's his watercolor in our collection of Eagle Head, painted in 1891. Scott went to work at age 15 as an apprentice in Boston to famed lithographer William Pendleton, where he, like Fitzhenry Lane, was introduced to drawing and painting. As previously mentioned, he and Lane formed their own business in the mid-1840s. After 15 years, Scott left the lithography business to devote full-time to painting, working in a Cambridge studio and traveling to the Catskills and the White Mountains, primarily painting sweeping landscapes such as we see here. He obviously also visited Manchester, as is evidenced by the watercolor of Eagle Head we've already seen, and this view of Reed's Island, done in 1893. Here's a vintage postcard view of the island with the yacht club at the far right to help you position it. Hailed it at one time as the best woman of the Boston School of French landscapists and impressionists, Anne Sophia Town Dara enjoyed a long career painting portraits, marine scenes, and landscapes, such as this impressive view of the White Mountains. Born and raised in Philadelphia, she was married in 1845 and embarked on her artistic career several years later under the tutelage of Paul Weber, a highly regarded German landscapist. She proved an apt pupil and by 1856 began to exhibit at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. In 1865, the Daras moved to Manchester, boarding with friends James and Annie Fields in the old Smith farmhouse on Proctor Street. James was Boston's most distinguished book publisher. Annie, his wife, was an author herself and known far and wide as a fabled hostess. The Fields were the center of a lively literary and arts community here in Manchester, which of course included the Daras. Around this time, Sophia apparently met prominent Boston author and poet Richard Henry Dana, who enlisted her to illustrate his most famous poem, The Buccaneer, when it was republished in a 2-volume set of illustrated verses in 1865. Some of you may know that Dana was also the first Bostonian to build a summer cottage here in Manchester, which in turn led the town to becoming a famous summer resort destination during what was known as the Gilded Age. In our collection is this plaster bust of Dana. It was presented to the Historical Society in 1907 by family members as a posthumous memorial to Dana, who died in 1879 at the age of 92. We do not know who the sculptor was, but we do know it was made by Capriani Brothers in Boston, the country's leading manufacturer of plaster reproductions of classical and contemporary statues. The Daras' connection to Manchester was strengthened when Sophia's brother, John Henry Town, built a summer home near Eagle Head. He passed away in 1875. 20 years later, at the time of Manchester's 250th anniversary, his children gave the town the granite fountain on the common as a memorial to their deceased parents. One can certainly assume Sophia was a frequent visitor to her brother's summer home, painting not only in Manchester but throughout Cape Ann. One of her favorite subjects was the umbrella tree, an ancient cedar on the property of the Richard Curtis family in West Manchester. Here we see 2 postcards of the Curtis estate, including the iconic tree. And now, the artist at work. 2 oils by Dara in our collection, which are painted on the Curtis property. Here we see the now familiar cedar trees. The clump to the left is a hay mound. Here's another view, looking out across the harbor toward Gales Point. This painting is on loan to the museum, but we'd certainly be happy to give it a permanent home. I don't see our lender in the crowd, unfortunately. 3 other Daras in our collection include this very dark oil entitled The Woodlot, and 2 more views of Reed's Island, one a watercolor and one an oil. In both, we see the first building on the island, a stone warehouse built there by a Mr. Lee in 1745. In the 1880s, when Mr. Reed owned the island, the warehouse was moved to higher ground and converted into a simple summer boarding house for visiting artists. To say Sophia Town Dara was prolific is an understatement. In 1872, a year after her death, the Museum of Fine Arts held a memorial exhibition of her work. 60 oils and 202 watercolors were on display. Many were designated for sale, much of the proceeds going to the Massachusetts SPCA as requested in her will. 2 of her paintings remain on permanent exhibit at the MFA. One of the largest paintings at the Trask House is this impressive oil of downtown Manchester done by George Herbert McCord. Another exceptionally prolific 19th century American artist, McCord was a master of oil, pastel, and watercolor. Here are some examples of his sweeping landscapes, many painted in New York, Canada, and throughout New England. For whatever reason, McCord's work has been somewhat dismissed, falling into a category known as second-generation Hudson River School. We don't know exactly when McCord visited Manchester, but we can certainly pinpoint where he set up his easel. Here we're looking across what was known as the Channel, from the west bank of the Sawmill Brook before it flows under Bridge Street and over the spillway into the harbor. Unlike most paintings of Manchester, the focus is not on the coastline, but rather the skyline of the downtown. The spire of the First Parish Church rises above the buildings that face School and Central Streets. The cupola to the left of the church spire is a rather romanticized view of the old townhouse, which stood where the fire station stands today. The rear of 7 Central can be seen to the right, and just look at all the activity along the riverbanks, the ducks splashing in the water, debris floats downstream, a fisherman tries his luck, and in the foreground, goldenrod offers a welcome burst of color. Since the townhouse was moved from School Street to Elm Street in 1891, we know McCord painting this interesting scene prior to that date. We are so fortunate that the donor, an important international art collector and major benefactor of the MFA, wanted us to have this special view of Manchester. It is now my pleasure to introduce a special guest, an expert on our next 2 important artists. Tom Halstead, as many of you will recall, gave a wonderful talk several years ago about his grandfather, Charles Hopkinson, and kindly led a guided tour of the Hopkinson studio on the grounds of the family estate, Shark's Mouth. Tom is an author, historian, retired public servant, and a fellow docent at the Cape Ann Museum, home to several important paintings by Hopkinson, as well as sculpture by Catherine Lane Weems, who Tom will discuss as well. Tom? That's the one you want to use.
Everybody take a little break while I have this.
Have you got your script?
Yeah, I have it here.
Okay. Just want to make sure you have it.
Can people hear me? I say in the back, but the back isn't very far back from the front, so it shouldn't be too hard. I can move this up a little bit. So I'm here to talk about 2 Manchester artists, Charles Hopkinson and Catherine Lane Weems. And Charlie Hopkinson, let me see, have we got him here? lived a long and productive life. He was born in Cambridge in 1869, the son of a school teacher, and died in 1962 at the age of 93. He lived most of his life in Manchester between Dana and White Beaches in a comfortable stucco house overlooking the craggy cliff of Shark's Mouth, and beyond, a spectacular view made for an artist. A panorama of sparkling seas, bold islands, and distant shores. He was my grandfather, and I had the pleasure of knowing him for many years. He taught me to sail, and he tried to teach me to paint. He was an indifferent student in his father's school. Here he is at age 8, but early on was showing great talent as an artist. Here is an early watercolor he did of a ship in distress in 1888 when he was still a teenager. Then, despite an academic record that bordered on the dismal, he was accepted to Harvard. Here he is at 18, where he managed to graduate in 1891 with a gentleman's C. He did leave his mark on Harvard with the many cartoons he drew for the humor magazine, The Lampoon, and he became its president in his senior year. Then it was off to New York and the Art Students League, and here he began his studies to become a serious artist. And there he met and married a glamorous fellow art student named Angelica Rathbone of Albany, whom he likened in a letter to a friend to a Botticelli painting. They went off to Paris together, where he began to do serious portraiture, winning a prize for this portrait of his wife with a monkey. I'm sorry, you can't see it very clearly, but she is not wearing enormous shoulder pads, but apparently is standing in front of a wingback chair, but it's very hard to make out the detail. The marriage failed soon after, however, and he returned to Cambridge in 1894. And there he landed his first commission, a portrait of a neighbor's 4-year-old son, the future poet E.E. Cummings. In 1903, he married again to Eleanor Curtis of Boston. They moved to Manchester, where they eventually raised 5 daughters in a newly built home given to them by Eleanor's mother as a wedding present, a few hundred yards from her own. They lived there year-round until the 1920s, when they began to stay in Manchester for most of the year, but in the colder months of the winter, they would mooch off friends in Cambridge who happened to be away in Europe or something like that with an empty house. But mostly they lived in Manchester and called it home. They eventually raised 5 homes. In 1913, some of his work was selected for the prestigious New York Armory show, including this portrait of 3 of his daughters. And then the commissions began to roll in. A portrait of Harvard Medical School professor Frank Watson, this is hanging in the Tavern Club in Boston now, led to dozens more portraits of professors, prime ministers, princes, and presidents. This is Calvin Coolidge. Supreme Court justices, including Oliver Wendell Holmes. This portrait's in the Harvard Law School. There's another seated portrait of Holmes in the Supreme Court building in Washington. And he painted priests, and he painted bishops, and he painted captains of industry, and made quite a living at it. And by the 1920s, he was much sought after. Time magazine dubbed him the Dean of American Portrait Painters. And that was in 1940, not in the 20s. So he was well known for a good 20 years as a premier professional commissioned portrait painter. And when not traveling to paint what he called his big game, he worked in his studio in Boston, taking the train home in time to paint what he really liked, hundreds of gorgeous oils and watercolors of the scene around him. And where the commissioned portraits were formal and academic, the landscapes were unfettered, ahead of their time, awash in flamboyant colors and shapes, often bordering on the abstract. There's this one particularly. Typically, they were of the scene from his front lawn or out this studio window, which he painted winter and summer. And this painting, in the museum's collection, is a fine example, and it's just this scene that I will now turn to, of an extraordinary event that happened right sort of in the center of that painting in 1922. On July 27th of that year, which coincidentally was his 53rd birthday, a strange sight appeared a few miles offshore. A large burning ship drifting toward Dana Island, Graves Island, that's on the right here, that's Egg Rock on the left. Halfway Rock is just out of sight behind Dana Island, but that is more or less where this ship came drifting down from. And it was the hulk of what had once been the USS New Hampshire, later called the Granite State, a 74-gun ship of the line of the U.S. Navy, first laid down in 1816, but oddly enough not launched until 1864 on the eve of the Civil War, when it was used as a store ship and later as a training vessel. In the years after the war, it had fallen on hard times. It had been burnt, it had sunk, it had been raised again, and at last towed off to be sold for scrap. It was under tow again, minus the ice, towards Eastport, Maine on that July day. When it caught fire again, the tow line parted, and the burning vessel drifted toward shore, fetching up around midnight on the southwest corner of Dana Island. In the days that followed, swarms of scavengers, and there they are, motored, sailed, rowed, and swam to the wreck, carting off whatever they could salvage. Hopkinson painted that happy scene several times, including this watercolor now in the Manchester Historical Museum. And nearly 100 years later, as Peter Spangler can certainly attest to, if not others, the wreck is still a destination for scuba divers, and after big storms, massive oak timbers still poke up through the sand along the beach, ready for the plucking by beachcombers armed with axes, sledgehammers, and chainsaws, hoping to find the 3 golden spikes reputed to be buried in the old ship's timbers. One of those timbers is displayed just outside the entrance to the Manchester Historical Museum. If it once harbored the golden spikes, only John Huss knows, and he's not telling. I dug one out of one of the timbers myself, but it turns out to be only bronze. But it's heavy, and it's a stout artifact. Some of you may also have done the same thing, as far as I know. As much as Hopkinson enjoyed painting these glorious land and seascapes, he took equal pleasure in painting his family and friends. Here he is with his wife and 5 daughters in 1924. This portrait of the family group is at the MFA now, and sometimes is on display, not often enough to satisfy the family. The 5 daughters are shown here in 1917. His daughter Ibby, that's my mother, in 1912, and the 3 dancing girls. And you probably, anyone who has been to the Cape Ann Museum can't miss this painting. It's sitting in the middle of the atrium, the Cape. These are the 3 of his daughters, Ellie, Mary, and Harriet, from left to right, which he started painting in 1917 and finished 6 years later. It now hangs in the atrium gallery at the Cape Ann Museum. And in addition to his family, he painted many of his friends and neighbors. And one of those friends lived just a few hundred yards along the shore opposite Dana Island. And her name was Catherine Lane. And he painted her, they did this portrait of her when she was a beautiful 21-year-old in 1920. This portrait was a big hit with critics when it was exhibited in New York, and one of them called it superlative, the most striking thing in the show, and thought Hopkinson a better portrait artist than John Singer Sargent. I like this portrait particularly because Hopkinson, as he frequently wrote in his memoirs, he was a wonderful portrait painter because he spent so much time getting to know his subject. He would spend 80% of the time, whether he had a sitter in front of him, they were chatting. He got to know the personality, the feelings, and the concerns of the subject, and those often showed up in the features. And even in this 21-year-old young girl, you get a good sense of what kind of character she has, and their self-confidence, and the sense that she's going to go someplace. I didn't pause long enough over some of those earlier portraits, but there's a couple of those. There's one Professor Beale leaning forward there on his desk that I think is a remarkable character study. Anyway, Kay and her mother, her father had died in 1915 when she was just 16, lived in the winter in Boston's Back Bay and in the summer at the Chimneys an aptly named mansion on a bluff overlooking Dana Beach and Island, built on the site where Richard Henry Dana had built an equally grand house for his father. You saw the little lithograph earlier on in John's presentation. The elegant gardens were designed by the Olmsted brothers landscape firm. This is the son of famous Frederick Lee Olmsted and his brother, who formed a firm that did, I believe they designed Masconomo Park as well, and they may have designed other places in the Manchester area. Well, Kay Lane, oh, excuse me. That's not Kay Lane at all. I'll stay with this. I thought we had a photo of Kay coming up. Too hard to find it. Kay Lane was born in 1899 with not just the proverbial silver spoon, but an entire silver service in her mouth. In later years, she worried that her family's great wealth would complicate her acceptance as a competent artist. Late in life, she wrote a memoir entitled, you may have seen it, Odds Were Against Me, which she no doubt meant in part that it was difficult for a woman to be taken seriously as an artist. While this was no doubt true, her wealth may have been as much an impediment as her gender, at least in her own mind. Her father, Gardner Martin Lane, was a highly successful financier and president of the Board of Trustees of the Museum of Fine Arts. Her mother, Emma, a Baltimore heiress and daughter of a classical scholar, was forever prodding Kay to have a beautiful debut. She did in Baltimore, to marry well and to settle down to a comfortable grande dame's existence, rather than getting her hands dirty working long hours in a bleak and grubby studio. Her mama may have much preferred her daughter, here comes a slide, to live the life of a Downton Abbey heiress, there we are, than that of a struggling artist, even if that struggle was only for acceptance and not for income. Note the similarity. Perhaps helped by the fact that her father had been president of the MFA's Board of Trustees, she was accepted to the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, where she found herself studying under Charles Grafley and George Demetrius, both renowned sculptors who spent their summers in Gloucester. Grafley was a hard taskmaster who at first rejected her attempts, but soon recognized her talent and began to encourage her, as did Demetrius and noted animal sculptor Anna von Hyatt, later Anna Hyatt Huntington, working in studios in Boston and Manchester, where she remodeled the stable into a studio large enough to eventually accommodate the sculpture of a full-sized rhinoceros. Photo shows her working on it in clay that later was cast in bronze. Well, you'll see that later on. She started out modeling the human figure, but soon discovered that her métier was in depicting animals, and one of her first successful animal subjects was a baby elephant that she studied at the Bronx Zoo. When asked why she preferred to work on animals and not people, she would reply that animals never criticized her work, and besides, they didn't have relatives. She went on to depict dozens of other animals: foxes, dogs, rabbits, bears, and this little bear is in the Manchester Museum's collection. She made multiple editions of many of these small animal sculptures. Nearly 50 of them are on permanent display in a dedicated gallery at the Boston Museum of Science. And one of her major commissions, beginning in 1930, was to adorn the Harvard Biological Laboratories, now known as the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology, with a variety of sculptures, friezes, and other ornamentation. Carved into the brick facade, 5 stories up below the roof, are more than 30 varieties of wildlife, ranging from flocks of pelicans to a pack of tigers and the troop of African elephants you see here. The bronze entry doors are decorated with cutouts of plants, insects, and sea creatures, and flanking the doorway are a pair of bronze Indian rhinoceroses, each weighing 3 tons. She named them Vicky and Bessie after 2 queens of England. You may remember who those were. A fiberglass replica of Bessie stands outside the entrance to the museum school, often startling the drivers of cars passing by on the Fenway. And one of Weems's last major sculptures was Dolphins of the Sea, begun in 1974 when she was 75. and finished in 1979. It stands at the entrance of the New England Aquarium. The dolphins' bronze backs are shiny from the bottoms of many children who have played on them. Kay Lane was single most of her life. Suitors came and went, but none interested her until she was almost 50, when she married New York financier F. Carrington Weems. Though they had known each other for nearly 20 years, he had been so intent on not being seen as a fortune hunter that he told her he could not marry her until he had made enough money to match her pile, as he said, as he called it. And 15 years her senior, he was already in his 60s when they finally married, presumably with matching piles, in 1947. And 82 when he died 19 years later in 1966. So theirs was a short, though a happy marriage. And though they turned over her family home on Marlborough Street in Boston to the French Cultural Center, now the Alliance Française, she and Weems kept the chimneys in Manchester for their summer residence, spending winters in his New York apartment after his death. She lived in Manchester year-round. After his death, she lived in Manchester year-round. Kay Weems died in 1989, but the hundreds of lithe, graceful creatures she created, along with the ponderous Vicky and Bessie, live on around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was not only informative, but very entertaining as always. Well, Catherine Lane Weems, here it is. While Catherine Lane Weems had a well-established reputation, I just need to get, there we go, as a sculptor, less well known is the work of Paul Adrien Brodeur, perhaps because his specialty was bas-relief, such as we see in this montage of his work. Paul Adrien Brodeur was born in 1894, trained in bas-relief sculpture at the Massachusetts College of Art, and then graduated from the Harvard Dental School in 1917. That same year, Brodeur volunteered to serve as a medical officer with the French Army during World War I. Upon his discharge, he returned to Harvard, where he taught orthodonture for 8 years, establishing a strong relationship with the university's administration in the process. This led to a number of commissions for bas-relief portraits of Harvard dignitaries, such as this one of Harvey Cushing, a noted pioneer in brain surgery and a professor at both the Harvard and Yale Schools of Medicine. What we see here is a half-size plaster reduction of the original bronze plaque sculpted by Brodeur upon the retirement of Cushing from Harvard in 1932. This reduction in our collection was one stage in arriving at a 2-inch oblong bronze medal of Cushing. 200 of these medals were then struck and offered for sale. Brodeur's original bronze relief of Cushing is displayed at the Harvard Medical School, and 2 of the medals are in the collections of the MFA and the Fogg Art Gallery. Also in our collection is this life-size plaster cast coated in bronze plate of the bas-relief of Harvard President Abbott Lawrence Lowell, done in 1937. Again, the original sculpture belongs to Harvard. Both the reliefs of Cushing and Lowell that were given to the Manchester Historical Museum were given to us by Brodeur's son, David, in 2007. In 1958, Brodeur, seen here, moved to Manchester, living on Walker Road and sharing a practice with local dentist Jimmy Reed until his death in 1967. The final artist we will meet on our tour is another sculptor, George Ahrens. Born in Russia in 1896, Ahrens came to the United States at age 10. He studied art at the Boston Museum School, then moved to New York to study at the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design. Upon graduation, he established studios in both Brookline and Gloucester and began a much acclaimed career as a sculptor. He is known for large, idealized figures in bronze and marble, and also experimented with direct carving in wood and stone. Toward the end of his long career, Ahrens' work became increasingly abstract, but always filled with a sense of joy and love of life. Many fine examples of his work are displayed at the K-BAM Museum. In 1938, Manchester's Elder Brethren, a local men's organization, proposed to erect a monument to honor Chief Masconomo and have it placed in the park bearing his name. They secured funds from the Federal Arts Project of the WPA in Washington and commissioned George Ahrens to create a plaster model for approval. Not surprisingly, their vision of Masconomo and that of the sculptor were poles apart. Gordon Abbott writes this about the proposed statue in his 2003 Town History. Instead of a standard Hollywood Indian with feathered headdress and tomahawk, Ahrens has sensitively sculpted Masconomo in an almost mystic state of repose, standing with eyes closed and arms folded, his long hair braided and touching his bare chest on either side. The sachem's lower body is wrapped in a sleek and simple robe. The elder brethren were less impressed, summarily rejecting Ahrens' model, comparing it to an Egyptian mummy, a Jesuit priest, and an Indian squaw. 40 years later, former Manchester town official and newspaperman Herb Kenny wrote a letter to the Cricket, reviving the story of the rejected statue and suggesting the town purchase and display the life-size bronze statue as originally conceived by Ahrens. The idea immediately took hold. A committee was formed and donations began to pour in, but only enough to fund the purchase of the original 30-inch high plaster model from Ahrens' widow, and then have it cast in bronze. Today, the bronze Masconomo can be seen in the front lobby of the town hall, while in the Trask House, we display Ahrens' original plaster model alongside Tappan's portrait of the chief. One subject, two interpretations, and I hope a provocative way to conclude today's tour of the galleries of the Manchester Historical Museum. Thank you.